Hello, welcome. If you're here, you probably want to learn the basics of shapes and forms. Now, personally, I used to get so overwhelmed trying to draw all these complex things until I realized it's mostly just simple shapes and forms underneath. I'm here to show you how you can stop focusing on the details first and start building your drawings from the structure up. Of course, we have to start with the fundamentals and understand that 2D shapes are flat, like circles, squares, and triangles, while 3D shapes, of course, have forms and have depth, like spheres, cubes, and cylinders. Now, for example, a circle is a shape, but when you give it volume, it becomes a sphere. And you give it volume and depth using lighting or playing with your line work, different shadings and colors, and even contour lines that you can use to wrap around a shape to show that it's 3D. Since we're on the topic of lines, it's very important to help distinguish between lines and shapes and forms. Lines are what you use to build everything. Straight lines, for example, can give you structure like boxes and buildings, more soft structures like the body or clothing, fabric, etc. Making clean lines in your initial sketch can help you be more intentional with your lines, and there's nothing wrong with chicken scratching. However, I personally find that trying to have clean lines in my initial sketch has eventually helped me understand my forms and shapes better. Everything you draw, however, can be broken down into 3 core forms, or a mixture of these 3 core forms. You've probably seen these before: the sphere, the cube, and the cylinder. So a head, for example, can be said to be the shape of a sphere, a mug is like a cylinder, and a book can basically be like a cube. And it doesn't have to be exact, but because you can visualize these main core forms, complex things like the human head, hands, clothing, accessories, backgrounds, all of these start from these basic forms. And it's very important that you are able to visualize these forms even if they are not fully visible in your reference. So for example, here we see that there's a few books, there's a mug, but your reference does not fully show the subject. You need to be able to draw your subject in the fullest without having the reference. A quick note, however, before we continue, is that difficulty can depend on the perspective, and we will not be covering that in this video. For now, let's just keep it simple. Now let's see everything in action, and we will be calling this part deconstructing, and we will be starting off with simplification. I'm going to start teaching you how to actually break down your references into these basic shapes and forms that we've discussed so far, and we will be starting with simplification. It sounds exactly how it is. The goal is to simplify what you see. So for example, here you have a slightly detailed subject, and you can watch as I break her down into basic shapes. We have something like a square, a little bit of a circular square rectangle here and there, and see how I'm not drawing any details, just the main structure. Also note how I made myself some reference lines on the reference image itself. Now that I have some reference line, I place my basic shapes, these simplified shapes, relative to these reference lines. And this helps me make sure that the drawing that I'm doing is as close as I can or want it to be with the reference image. The next phase of deconstructions are silhouettes, and this is basically a different version of simplification, but instead of drawing your shapes using lines, using clean lines like before, we will be using the lasso tool instead to make the shapes just straight up. This is my personal favorite. I like to focus on the silhouette first and get the big shapes right before doing anything else. I block in the large, big shapes only. Again, no details. So notice how, again, I have my reference lines in the reference photo. You can see how the reference lines are very clear. The subject is basically in a rectangle. And the painted walls in the reference also provide some horizontal reference lines that we can use for her clothing, her legs, etc. So just some final tips. Again, visualize the full form, not just the outline, thinking in 3D even if it's a flat picture. You also want to compare the shapes and lines to each other, like the reference lines that I've talked about before, or even forming your own reference lines as I showed, to understand the placement and proportion of the depth of your forms or your shapes. My second advice is to squint your eyes at your reference to simplify what you see into larger shapes and values. So sometimes it's very hard to see what your shapes look like if your subject is very complex, or even if it's not complex. Squinting your eyes kind of blurs the image and you can see the general shape of your reference or your subject. Now my take-home practice for you is to find references or take your own photos of people, objects, buildings, food, anything that has shape, and spend about 5 to 7 minutes just blocking down the shapes. Pinterest is a great place to look for references, but if your focus is on practicing your shape language, your form language, I would advise to try stock photos instead, like Pixabay. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. That is it for this video. Thank you so much for following along, and I hope you learned a thing or two about shapes and forms. Bye!